On live television, it only took one carefully placed question to change the mood in the room. And suddenly Serena Williams was no longer just promoting a new chapter of her life. She was defending the one thing the public had judged for years, herself. Subscribe to Prime Talk, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. At first glance, the moment did not look like a confrontation. There was no raised voice, no dramatic walk-off, no producer rushing in to cut to commercial. That is exactly why it mattered. Because sometimes the most revealing live TV moments do not arrive with chaos. They arrive with a pause, a look, and one follow-up question that forces a global superstar to speak more honestly than anyone expected. By the time Serena Williams sat down at the table on The View in May of 2018, she was already far more than a tennis champion. She was one of the most recognizable athletes on earth, a woman whose career had been measured in Grand Slam titles, comeback stories, and cultural impact. But this appearance was different. Serena was not just returning as an icon of competition. She was arriving as a new mother, a wife, and the subject of a personal HBO docuseries, Being Serena. The public knew the champion. This interview promised something more intimate. It promised the woman behind the image. And that is where the stakes changed. Because Serena Williams had spent much of her adult life being watched, discussed, praised, dissected, and judged in ways that went beyond sports. Her power on the court made her legendary. Her body, her confidence, her emotion, and even her silence made her a target. For years, the conversation around Serena had never stayed only on tennis. It drifted into appearance, race, femininity, motherhood, discipline, and whether a woman this dominant was somehow too much for the world around her. So when she came to The View, this was not just another celebrity stop on daytime television. It was a live setting, a round table, a place built on conversation, not control. And sitting across from Serena was Sunny Hostin, a co-host known for asking direct questions with a lawyer's precision and a broadcaster's timing. Sunny was not there to flatter a guest through a safe segment. She had a way of taking a statement and pressing just enough to see what was underneath it. On a show like The View, that matters. The atmosphere can feel warm, even casual, but the format leaves very little room to hide. A guest can arrive expecting an easy conversation and suddenly find themselves answering for something much deeper. That tension was already built into the booking. Serena had been speaking more openly about motherhood and about the fears that came with raising her daughter. Alexis Olympia Ohanian Jr. She had also been reflecting on her own life, especially the years she endured criticism about her body. She had written emotionally about looking at her daughter and seeing the same strong arms, the same powerful frame, the same visible inheritance that had once made Serena herself the subject of relentless commentary. It was personal, protective, and raw. And in a television environment designed to keep things moving, those emotions were now about to be tested in real time. What made the interview especially compelling was the contrast between the public image and the private history. Serena was one of the most accomplished athletes in modern history. Few people on earth knew pressure the way she did. She had played through injury, through expectation, through worldwide scrutiny, through the burden of being called the greatest while still being asked to prove it again and again. She had done that in stadiums, under lights, with millions watching. But daytime television is a different kind of pressure. On the court, Serena controlled the pace with her serve. In a live interview, someone else asks the questions. Someone else decides when to dig deeper. And when the subject turns from trophies to wounds, even the strongest public figures can be caught in a moment they did not fully plan to revisit. That is what makes this exchange so memorable. Not because it exploded, but because it narrowed. The room went from broad conversation to something almost personal, almost fragile. A discussion that began with Serena's life as a mother and public figure started inching toward a harder truth. What it had actually cost her to be Serena Williams in front of the world. And that is where Sunny Hostin's role becomes crucial in this story. Sunny understood that Serena had said something bigger than a polished television answer. Beneath the smiles and the studio rhythm, there was a line that demanded clarification. Not for controversy, not for spectacle, but because if Serena meant what she had said, then the audience was hearing more than celebrity reflection. They were hearing a woman revisit the emotional price of being judged since she was a teenager. That is the kind of moment live television can create when everyone in the room realizes the conversation has shifted. The View itself was the perfect setting for that kind of shift. Unlike a late-night couch interview built around jokes and promotional clips, The View thrives on direct exchange. The hosts are not simply moderators. They challenge, interpret, interrupt, empathize, and sometimes force a guest to define their own words more clearly than they intended. For a figure like Serena, whose public life had often been flattened into headlines, that format created both an opportunity and a risk. She could tell the truth in her own voice. But she also had to do it without the protection of rehearsal, editing, or distance. And in 2018, Serena was standing at a crossroads. All of it was sitting there with her at the table. The audience could see the superstar. The hosts could see the guest. But what live television was about to reveal was the woman underneath the image, the one who had spent years learning how to survive public judgment and was now being asked to explain what that history meant for the next generation, for her daughter, and for herself. That is why this moment mattered. Because when Serena Williams looked ahead to her child's future, the conversation stopped being about fame and started becoming about inheritance. About what a mother remembers. About what a daughter might one day face. About how success does not protect a woman from being reduced, criticized, or misunderstood. And once that truth entered the room, Sunny Hostin did what experienced live television hosts do best. She pressed just a little further. And with that, a promotional interview began turning into something far more revealing than anyone expected. Before that live conversation ever reached the question that tightened the room, Serena Williams had already lived through years of public scrutiny that most athletes never face. Her greatness was obvious. Her vulnerability was not. That was part of the tension that followed her everywhere. By 2018, the world knew Serena as a champion, as a once-in-a-generation competitor, as the face of dominance in women's tennis. But the same public that admired her strength had also spent years turning that strength into a subject of debate. Serena was celebrated for winning, but she was also examined in a way that went beyond sport. Her body had been discussed as if it were public property. Her muscles were questioned. Her femininity was questioned. Her intensity was questioned. Even at the height of her success, when the results should have ended every argument, the commentary often shifted away from her achievements and toward how she looked while achieving them. She had heard the insults for years. She had been called too strong, too muscular, too different. She had been accused of not fitting the image people wanted from a female champion. And over time, that kind of attention does something subtle. It turns accomplishment into defense. It forces a person to keep explaining what should never need explanation. That history mattered because Serena did not walk into the view as someone promoting a single project. She arrived carrying a personal archive of public judgment. And in the months before that appearance, her life had changed in ways the cameras could not easily summarize. She had become a mother. She had married Alexis Ohanian. She was preparing the public to see more of her private world through Being Serena, the HBO documentary series that promised something very different from the usual sports profile. This was not just a story about titles and trophies. It was about transition, motherhood, identity, pressure, recovery, uncertainty. The champion was no longer speaking only as an athlete trying to win again. She was speaking as a woman who had survived a frightening childbirth experience, stepped into a new role at home, and was now trying to understand what the future looked like on and off the court. That combination made every interview around that period more emotionally loaded than it first appeared. Because Serena was not just returning to public life. She was returning to public interpretation. Even motherhood, which many celebrities present in soft, polished language, came with sharper edges in Serena's case. When she looked at her daughter, she was not only seeing joy. She was also seeing inheritance. She saw the same strong arms, the same powerful frame, the same physical traits that had made her both exceptional and vulnerable in the public eye. For many viewers, that may have sounded like a simple mother's reflection. But for Serena, it was much heavier than that. It meant wondering whether the same world that had body-shamed her for years would one day do the same to her child. That fear did not come out of nowhere. She had already written openly about it. She had reflected on her mother, Oracene Price, and how she must have endured watching her daughter get criticized so young and so often. Serena had begun connecting her own past to her daughter's future. That is when the conversation stopped being about celebrity and became something more intimate and unsettling. She was not revisiting old criticism for sympathy. She was measuring it against motherhood. And once she did that, the emotional temperature changed. On television, that kind of subject can either stay carefully packaged or become something real very quickly. The setting of The View made that shift almost inevitable. The show is built around personalities who do more than nod along. They ask. They press. They react. A guest may arrive expecting a broad, supportive exchange, and still find themselves pulled into something more exacting. Serena knew she was entering a format where women at the table would engage her directly, not just admire her from a distance. That is part of the appeal of the show, but it is also the risk. A live daytime panel can feel conversational right up until the moment one sentence gets singled out and pushed further. And there was already enough in Serena's story to make that likely. She was discussing motherhood at a time when the public was newly aware of how dangerous childbirth had been for her. She was talking about body image after years of hearing herself reduced to stereotypes. She was talking about love and protection as a new mother while also trying to navigate the expectations of a comeback. The contradiction was enormous. The public wanted the invincible Serena back on court. But the woman sitting in interviews was also processing fear, memory, and change. She was being asked to sell inspiration while still carrying scars. That is the kind of contradiction live TV can expose in a single instant. And on that day, there was reason to think that could happen. Because Serena was not dealing with distant history. The emotions were current. Her daughter was still an infant. Her memories of criticism were still vivid. Her reflections on her mother were still raw. She had reached a point in life where success had not erased the past. It had only given her a new angle from which to see it. Sunny Hostin, for her part, was exactly the kind of interviewer who could recognize when a guest had just opened a door to something deeper. Sunny's style was not built on noise. It was built on precision. She listened for the line beneath the line. If a guest made a broad emotional statement, she often moved closer to the specific meaning of it. That is what creates memorable TV. Not necessarily hostility, but clarity. And clarity can feel far more intense than argument. So as Serena sat there discussing motherhood, body confidence, and the fear of what her daughter might one day face, the segment was already moving toward a more delicate edge. To viewers half paying attention, it may have still sounded like a thoughtful daytime interview. But underneath it, the pressure was building. Serena was speaking about old wounds in the present tense. She was no longer just describing who she had been. She was revealing what still lived with her. The challenge for any host in that moment is whether to move on or go further. Move on, and the show keeps its rhythm. Go further, and the interview risks becoming real in a way no one can fully control. And once that question arrived, there would be no editing it out, no softening it later, no taking back the silence that came just before Serena answered. The moment arrived quietly, almost gently. Serena Williams was seated at the view table on May 1st, 2018, speaking about motherhood, about her daughter, and about the letter she had written to her own mother. The conversation was still moving in the rhythm of daytime television, warm enough to feel familiar, but serious enough to carry weight. Serena had been talking about looking at baby Olympia and seeing the same strong arms and legs she saw in herself. Then she said something that shifted the room. She admitted she did not know how she would react if her daughter had to endure what she had gone through. That line landed. It did not explode. It settled. Sunny Hostin heard it immediately. Instead of letting the moment pass, Sunny asked the question that turned a broad reflection into a direct confrontation with Serena's past. Her follow-up was simple and sharp. What did you mean by that? It was not shouted. It was not theatrical. But because it happened live, in front of the other co-hosts, the studio audience, and the cameras, the question did what only a live question can do. It forced Serena to stop speaking in general terms. It required an answer, right there, without edits, without a reset, and without the distance of a prepared statement. There was a beat before Serena answered. Then she said it plainly. She said she had been body-shamed basically since she had been in the public eye. In that instant, the interview stopped being only about motherhood and promotion. It became about exposure. Serena was no longer speaking as a celebrity offering a polished anecdote. She was identifying, in direct language, the burden that had followed her from adolescence into adulthood. Live on air, she named the thing underneath the fear. Not criticism of her game. Not pressure to win. Body shaming. Public judgment. Years of people talking about her body as if her success gave them permission. Once she said it, the segment slowed. Serena continued, and the details made the moment heavier. She explained that she had liked how she looked until she entered the public eye, and then the conversation around her changed. Suddenly, she said, she did not like who she was. It was a deeply personal admission, especially from someone the world associated with power. Her words did not come with anger. They came with clarity. That is what made them so striking. The strongest athlete in the room was describing the quiet damage done by commentary that had followed her for years. On live television, that kind of truth changes the atmosphere. No one can pretend they did not hear it. The exchange kept moving, but carefully now. Serena looked backward and forward at the same time. She spoke about her mother, Oracene Price, and about how she now understood her differently. As a daughter, she had lived through the criticism. As a mother, she was newly imagining what it must have felt like for Oracene to watch it happen. Serena said that when she looked at her daughter and then thought about her mother seeing her endure all that negativity about her body, she did not know how her mother had done it. The line brought the moment even closer to the bone. It was no longer only about Serena being judged. It was about a family watching that judgment in real time across generations. Then came the most protective line of the segment. Serena said that if anyone ever said anything about Olympia, she would take her tennis racket and say, "Let's talk now, say it again." The audience could hear the shift in her voice. The humor was there, but so was the warning. It was a mother's instinct expressed in the language of an athlete. The image was memorable because it was so immediate. For years, Serena had absorbed the public gaze herself. But once her daughter entered the frame, the tolerance was gone. What she had endured for herself was one thing. What she imagined for Olympia was another. On live TV, that protective flash said as much as any long explanation could. The table listened. The room understood that the interview had crossed into something more personal than the usual daytime segment. Serena was not unraveling. She was not refusing to answer. She was doing something harder. She was staying composed while saying something plainly painful. That is why the moment held. There was no dramatic music, no viral shouting match, no cutaway to rescue the mood. It was simply Serena Williams, under studio lights, answering a tough follow-up question with the kind of honesty that live television cannot soften once it is spoken. And because it was live, every pause mattered. There was no editing out the silence between Sunny's question and Serena's reply. No trimming down the discomfort of hearing a champion explain that fame had changed how she saw herself. No polishing the weight of a mother imagining her daughter inheriting the same public cruelty. The confrontation, if that is what it was, happened in the space between control and truth. Sunny pressed for clarity. Serena defended herself by telling the truth as directly as she could. She did not retreat from the question. She answered it, and in answering it, she made the moment bigger than the interview itself. By the time the exchange moved forward, the tone had changed for everyone watching. Serena had come to discuss her life, her documentary, and the joy of new motherhood. But what live television revealed was something deeper. Even a global icon, even a woman with 23 Grand Slam titles, had spent years learning how to survive being misread in public. And when Sunny Hostin asked one precise question on air, Serena did not dodge. She defined the wound, protected her daughter, and reclaimed the story in her own words. What made that moment linger wasn't just what Serena Williams said. It was what no one could undo after she said it. Live television has a way of revealing truth in its rawest form. There are no filters once the words leave your mouth, no edits to soften impact, no second takes to reshape meaning. And in that brief exchange on The View, something irreversible happened. A narrative that had followed Serena for years, often controlled by headlines, commentary, and outside voices, was pulled back into her own hands. Because this time, she named it herself. What's striking is how controlled she remained throughout the moment. There was no emotional collapse, no visible frustration directed at Sunny Hostin for asking the question. If anything, Serena leaned into it. She didn't deflect. She didn't generalize. She answered with precision. And in doing so, she shifted the power dynamic of the conversation. That's what made it feel like a confrontation without ever becoming one. Sunny's role in that moment matters just as much. She didn't interrupt, didn't over-explain, didn't rescue the silence. She asked, and then she let Serena speak. In live television, that restraint is rare. Many hosts fill space quickly, trying to maintain rhythm. But hey, the pause was the point. The silence gave Serena room to say something real. And once she did, the weight of it belonged to everyone in that room, and everyone watching at home. Moments like this don't go viral because they are loud. They go viral because they are honest. And honesty, especially from someone as globally recognized as Serena, cuts through in a way that spectacle never can. For years, audiences had seen her dominate courts, win championships, redefine excellence. But here, they saw something else, the cost of that visibility, the unseen pressure, the internal shift that happens when the world starts talking about you instead of to you. That's what turned this from an interview into a revelation. Because it wasn't just about Serena anymore. It was about how public narratives are built and who gets to control them. Serena's answer did something subtle but powerful. It exposed the gap between perception and reality. To the world, she was strength, dominance, confidence. But in her own words, she revealed a time when that confidence was shaped, challenged, by constant scrutiny. That contrast is what stayed with viewers. Not just what she endured, but how long she carried it without saying it this plainly. And when she finally did, it didn't feel like vulnerability. It felt like ownership. That's the difference. By the end of the segment, the conversation had technically moved on, but emotionally, it hadn't. The energy in the room had shifted in a way that couldn't be reset. Because once truth enters a live broadcast, it stays there. Unedited, unfiltered, unforgettable. And that's what makes moments like this so rare. Not the tension, not the question, but the answer. If you want more real, unfiltered moments where celebrities drop the mask and take control of their story, this is just the beginning. White right pointing backhand index, subscribe to Prime Talk and turn on notifications, because the next live TV moment that changes everything could happen any second.